Hello and welcome to the OBHA podcast. I'm your host, Brian Middleton, and today we have Abigail Twyman joining us to talk about educational justice, the intersection of human rights, ethics, race, class, and disability status. Welcome, Abigail.
Hello, thank you, Brian. It's so nice to be here.
It's nice for you to be here. Thank you for joining us. It's really excited. Abigail, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Brian said, my name is Abigail Twyman. I generally go by Abby, but I answer to many things. And I am the founder of Action for a Peaceful World, as well as our new venture, Our Alaskan Oasis, which is a supported homeschool program. And I am actively working in the areas of behavioral science and social justice, and working to help develop a crew of people who are really wanting to activate and make a difference in the world.
Awesome. And you also have a podcast, right?
That is a fact. Thank you. Yes, our podcast is Tipsy Unicorns. And we do some of our episodes in partnership with the Beautiful Humans Social Change Cast, and then we also have our own channel that we publish podcasts on. And our focus, we just launched our second season, and this season we're really focused on learning and listening to people's origin stories. So like how they came to be where they are today in their life journeys, because we have found over the years that when people learn how to openly and honestly share their stories, that is kind of step one in the process of healing, where we can find common ground and realize that we are 100% not alone in this world in our experiencing of pain and suffering, and together is the only way that we can process through those things and move forward collectively together.
Awesome. And I'm guessing that folks, if you want to listen, well, not guessing, I know, if you want to listen to the Tipsy Unicorn podcast, you can listen to it on most of the channels where a podcast words can be found. I myself listen to it on Spotify, so definitely enjoy it. All right. So Abby,
thank you.
We're talking about educational justice, and for those who don't know this, I served as a special ed teacher for 7 years. I felt like it was service. I definitely enjoyed being a special ed teacher, aside from all the stressed out of my gourd times, but that's kind of what we're here to talk about. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I share that history of being a special education teacher as well as a certified behavior analyst. I've taught for two full school years. One full school year was at the very beginning of my career, just right after I got done with my master's degree. And this past school year was my second school year. And those two school years were separated by about 12 years. Wow. In between, I was focused on clinical practice as a behavior analyst.
Okay. And so in your experience as being a teacher and as a behavior analyst, what are some of the challenges that you've faced? And what are some challenges that you consistently see through your association and through your work that others face as well? Sorry, a few thoughts in there.
That's a great question. So, the interesting thing for me was just some observations that I made early on in my career. So I went to the University of Washington, and that's where I did my undergrad and graduate studies. And in my graduate studies in the Master's of Education program, my specialty was in, at that time they called it low incidence disabilities. So these were, I was specializing in working with individuals who were more significantly impacted and had more complex support needs. And, we were taught about person-centered planning, and we were taught about behavior analysis and, defining things in observable and measurable terms and supporting the whole person and the family. And so it was all, the education I got was very robust and very focused on the family and the whole person serving. And then when I got actually into the school system and began to, serve in that role as special education teacher, what I realized very quickly is that my training, my philosophical underpinnings of my practice were not consistently aligned with the philosophical underpinnings and the practice of the teachers with whom I was working. From administrators to general education teachers, and even some of the special, other special education people, practitioners I was working with, and parents. And so there was this really big disconnect, and it was difficult coming into that environment because I was geared up with this set of tools that have just been given and, shown how powerful and how powerful they could be in positively impacting the lives of people and their families. And then I actually got into practice and was like, well, this isn't actually happening. And my best and I think saddest example, but something that is very, very common, unfortunately, is during my first year of teaching, I was a resource room teacher. I had a caseload of 40, and the outgoing special education teacher was retiring, and that's why he left. And all of his reports and goals were not really in alignment with what I had been trained to do. So I had a lot of cleanup to do. In the paperwork side of things and kind of alignment with general education curriculum and all of that. But what was most striking was the behavior and the attitudes of the teaching staff towards the children that I was working with. In particular, I had one teacher who approached me day one of in service and was commenting about this particular student that everyone hated. The teachers hated him. The parents hated them. He was a hated child and nobody wanted him. And that was so heartbreaking because after I began to get to know this child and their family, I quickly came to realize that there was a significant amount of trauma in this person's life, and they were not being served adequately because of the beliefs and attitudes of the adults who were supposed to be nurturing and serving and supporting them. So that was kind of my introduction into the real world of special education that really got me to kind of see the disconnect. And that caused a lot of stress and frustration for me because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to help people. I wanted to empower people with tools. But I didn't know how to undo those deeply held beliefs that definitely seemed to be pervasive throughout that environment. And so after a year, I decided to leave public education for a time and go into clinical practice where I had, there were more people who kind of had the same philosophical underpinnings to their practice as I had been trained to. And in there, I developed my skills so I could have a more positive impact in those environments.
Yeah. And the attitudes that you've talked about, I encountered those attitudes a lot as well. And it was only through dogged, stubborn persistence to prove people wrong, and then later being equipped with some of the language that behavior analysis offered me, that I was able to convince people to change their minds. So one, I proved them wrong through the fact that I could take these kids who everybody else was like, oh man, this is a bad kid. And the kids definitely weren't perfect in their behavior, but what kid isn't? Like, these are little humans, let them be humans. So there's that. But like, the thing that worked for me the most as a special ed teacher was I just treated them like a person. And shocker, when I treat someone like a human, that little human responds to me like a human, and their behavior changed. Now, the reason I pursue behavior analysis is, one, I was trying to help my students better because I was still coming up against things that I didn't understand and I didn't know how to address. So more complex behaviors, more complex contingencies, things like that. And two, well, I just wanted to understand behavior better myself because I have a life of living behavior, and I'm autistic and I've experienced all these things. And so it's just like, oh, a lens that I can try to understand things in. And interestingly, the best thing to help teachers change their perspective, in my experience as a teacher and a behavior analyst, is a core behavior analytic principle, which is really funny considering that in a lot of behavior analysis really needs to get our act together and remember this core component. And this is best exemplified by a history teacher that I was working with. And this history teacher, we were working with a student, and this student was not a special ed student. But because I was the behavior support person for the entire school, I was a part of the MTSS system, the multi-tiered systems of support system that we have. And so we were trying to support in the classroom, and we were doing the child find process, which if anybody's familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act idea, that's required by schools to do if an individual is experiencing social, emotional, or educational challenges. The school and school district are required to go through the identification process and see if they qualify for either a 504 or an IEP. And I want to emphasize something really quickly for anybody who's not familiar with these rules and laws. No, it isn't just educational goals. If there's social emotional development being affected, do not believe a school district that tells you that, no, we don't have to do an IEP for anything other than education. That's utter horseshit. Please excuse my Germanic, but it's the truth. And you need to fight tooth and nail because they are breaking the law if they say that. And I'll fight tooth and nail for that. So anyways, supporting this student, turns out that this student just needed to be treated like a human. Shocker. There was some things going on at home, and the individual was not receiving adequate care. There was a situation of neglect. We pulled in other agencies to make sure there was an appropriate supports and things like that. So that way the individual was not going without. And I was also making sure, because I was working with a local food pantry, to keep food stocked because it was an issue of behavior due to the lack of nutritional needs being met. So I'm talking with this teacher. We're talking about in classroom. I'm pointing out that a lot of the functions of behavior are for attention and attention gaining, and pointing out that if the teacher can flip the script and start delivering attention for what the student is doing right instead of what the student's doing wrong, that in all the other classes where we've tried this, huge turnaround. Student went from failing and struggling to being an A+ student and engaged in a part of the classroom. And this teacher was resistant to that. And so I kind of moved on, started talking with them about stuff and just chatting. And I was telling him a little bit about the behavior analysis training I was doing. And he's like, well, what is that? Are you like going to be CSI or something? And I kind of laughed and told him a little bit about it. And as I was rapport building with him, a thought popped into my head. I need to tell him about one of the core idea of behavior analysis. And that core idea is that every behavior is right for that individual based on their learning history and environment. And so I was like, I want to, because he was a fellow nerd, is a fellow nerd. And so I was like, this is the nerdiest way of being compassionate. Can I just share this with you? And he was like, huh? And I told him that. And he sat back. He's like, can you say that again? And I said, every behavior is right for the individual based off their learning history and their environment. And then he was like, is that what you've been trying to tell me about this student? I'm like, uh-huh. And it clicked. It clicked. And that class went from being this student's class that he would do anything to avoid to, at the end of the year, A+. Kid would fight tooth and nail with anybody who tried to pull him out of that class because the teacher got it. He got how to be a nerdy, compassionate person. And it drives me nuts because the reason that teachers feel so jaded is because, one, we're not equipping them with the right training, in my opinion. And two, we're providing them with support and materials delivered by the lowest bidder. We're doing everything we can to not give the teachers what they need and expecting the teachers to solve the problems. And I have a master's of education with an administrative endorsement, and I went through the master's program for getting my administration endorsement. I've done the internship that was necessary for my administration endorsement. I've observed how administrators do things. And I know that this is, please be clear, I know this is not all school districts. But the job of the administrator, as I receive the training, is to surf a fine line between following the law and doing as very little as possible. That's my takeaway from both my experience and my education. And it's disgusting. And there's a reason why I've decided that despite the fact that I've passed with a high enough score to teach in almost every state in the union, I'm not going to become an administrator. I'm not going to be a principal or anything like that, because I can't live in that realm of, well, what can I do? What's the bare minimum? What can I not tell the parents? What can I get away with not telling them instead of pulling out the supports that the kid needs?
Yeah. And this is, so Brian, that story is exactly like the perfect setup for what it is that what I'm wanting to talk about today, because that is the common theme. And that is why we're talking about educational justice and all of the intersections that has with race and class and disability status and sex. And there are so many complexities, because what you're pointing to in that you're training it for administration echoes the words that I have heard administrators say when responding to me attempting to advocate for students, is that we don't have to do that. Like, our job is to provide the bare minimum. And that to me is extremely concerning, because we're setting up contingencies, right? So we're setting up the environment such that, do this and this will happen, do this or don't do this and that will happen, right? So there are these contingencies for reinforcement and punishment for the administrators and for the teachers are completely, in my opinion, out of alignment the thrust of the law, right?
Yeah.
With the human rights that have been delineated by the United Nations, with the Constitution and the amendments that are, entitle us to effective education, to the disability rights through the America's Disabilities Act, through, you mentioned the special education laws, through IDEA, the Individuals Disabilities Education Act. And so when you and I have kind of share those experiences and observations of patterns of behavior that as a behavioral scientist, I can understand, right? I can understand the human behavior and the contingencies in place that create an environment that reinforces certain patterns of behavior and punishes other patterns of behavior. But I would submit that while that has been the status quo, that is how we have been doing things, our systems are built on systems of oppression. And there are very clear patterns that we can see and are coming to be more and more clear to people that there's more to it, right? There's more to it than, oh, this person just has a disability. And so they're only capable of doing X, Y, and Z, right? That's an underlying belief that I hear. The reality is, we know training as behavioral scientists and as special educators with that extra level of training in behavioral science gives us this belief, and based on things that we've seen happen because we've done them, right? Our lived experience, that everyone is capable of learning. And, if the learner didn't learn, the teacher didn't teach. No matter, regardless of your disability status, regardless of your race, regardless of your sex, regardless of your class, if the learner didn't learn, the teacher didn't teach, period. Right? And so when I think about this issue, I think about the children in school districts in rural areas, like I'm living in right now in rural Alaska. I think about children in, urban school districts where there's, high teacher turnover and teachers who've been trained to believe certain things and do certain things. And the reality is that they have been set up for failure, and which in turn sets up the children for failure. Which in turn sets up the environment in which there's, can be a very toxic, coercive environment because, we're supposed to be seeing these outcomes. That's what we say we're doing. And then we don't have those outcomes. And then the finger pointing starts, right? It's not my problem. I'm doing my job. You're not doing your job, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm at the point now where, trying to kind of rise above the finger pointing, and put things in context, right? Put things in perspective for people and help people really understand what the what the heart of the issue is, and understand the role that each of us play in coming to a solution that is going to be resourceful and sustainable for everybody.
Yeah. Well, and so I have to say that my experience with the way that education does things didn't start as a teacher. To add to this, because you say systems of oppression, and so I had a very conservative upbringing. So because of that conservative upbringing, there's a part of me that's like, well, is this planned? And then I think about it and I'm like, oh no, this is the contingencies that are in play that create oppressive things. And I'll give you an example of this that's very real to me. Age of 12 years old, My parents homeschooled, but my mom figured out that the school district was required to do testing. So 12 or 13, maybe 14. I can't remember the exact age, but we go to the Herbert C. Green Middle School, and I get my IQ tested, and which is a very common assessment that's done. It's the Woodcock-Johnson test for intelligence, and you do cognitive and academic. And I don't know who this teacher was, but I really hope that this person had some really bad karma come her way because of what she said. Because after the assessment was done, she told my mom, if Brian flips burgers for a living, he's going to be lucky.
Wow.
Yeah. That's what my mother was told about me. Now, joke's on this idiot, or rather this person who believes the story that she's been told, who has bought into the systems of oppression. Mm-hmm. Joke's on her. I've got 2 undergraduates, a graduate degree, postmaster's certificate, and blah, 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 all the things. I'm a successful professional in all the ways that are possible, but it wasn't because of her. And if she had been my teacher instead of my parents insisting on homeschooling, how would things have changed? Mm-hmm. How did things change under her projected beliefs on the children that she was supposed to serve? And that's the heart of the issue. Is when you say systems of oppression, my first thought goes back to my original programming about the conservative upbringing. My second thought is, wait, hold on. What's Abby actually saying? And my third thought is, what are the contingencies that are in play that are reinforcing and creating these conditions? And how can we change them? Am I hitting the nail on the head? Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah, 1,000,000%, Brian. Okay. Because this story that you're sharing with me right now is like, this is the pattern that I have, through beginning, like through talking to people about this, repetitively. And I have heard similar stories from people, and that medical model, right? That discrepancy model, like we're going to do this test on you, and we're going to identify your IQ, and we're going to look at your academics, and we're going to say, based on these results, this is your what you're capable of becoming, right? Mm-hmm. And that, if you look back at the educational research that was being done, like back in the, early times, like the, 40s, 50s, 60s, like they were actually doing research to prove these deeply held beliefs, right? Yeah. And so, in terms of, like, for instance, the belief that race is linked to IQ, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're of a certain race, then you automatically have a lower IQ and have less, aptitude, which we know is BS, right? Mm-hmm. That's has been proven over and over again. If the learner didn't learn, the teacher didn't teach. Behavior is behavior. Humans are humans. Organisms learn, right? Yeah. And so, but that what your story brought up for me, a story of, and this was an adult. I was, I had the opportunity to work with, or just get to know on a personal level. Wasn't working in a school with her or anything, but I was talking to her about what I do and my, how how I approach education and life. And she shared with me a similar story about, being tested when she was young. All of the kids in her family were tested, and some of them performed really well, and some of them performed really poorly. And she was one of the ones who performed really poorly. And not only did she experience kind of that negative response from the school professionals, it also transferred to home. She was treated differently. Like she was treated as if something was wrong with her. You know, she's a woman, she has a low IQ, her play, you know, and that, I mean, just think of all of the verbal behavior that comes up when I say those words, right? Thinking about our sex roles and our, you know, our ability level. And it was, to me, it was so heartbreaking because I could see in her face and her body language, I could hear in her words that she was sharing with me how deeply that still impacted her. Even though she had done, you know, kind of, again, like, you know, kind of proved them wrong. Like I am capable of doing good things. Those words that people put in her head, right? She kept those. She kept those deep in her heart and deep in her brain. And that kind of like defined her identity, right? There's something wrong with me. I am deficient. I have to do this. And that to me, it got like, this circles back around to the bigger kind of the bigger thing that I am beginning to look at in relation to our shared rights, our shared human rights to education, and to dignity and to equal treatment, to a standard of living and a standard of care that meets our needs as individuals. Our right to kind of fully develop, not just academics, because, you know, you mentioned kind of this, you know, this narrative in the education system. It's only about reading, writing, and math, right? But it's more than that. We have the right. The UN has defined a set of human rights, 25, 26, and 27. I encourage you all to look at. They're related to the standard of living, the right to our education, and our right to participate in cultural life. And I would suggest that if we are not ensuring that our school systems are adequately meeting the needs of the children and the families, that we are not only doing them a disservice, we are violating their human rights.
Yeah. I want to throw something in here because I know that there are members of the audience who are perhaps a little bit more conservative, and a lot of these ideas are speaking to the moral language of the more progressive approach for folks. But I want to speak to the moral language of the conservative for a moment, because I feel like we can have the same value. I do not consider myself, I am neither progressive nor conservative, not here to talk about politics, don't want to talk about politics, but I do want to talk about moral foundations. And I tried to understand the moral foundations of each group, because I feel like a big part of our problem is that we don't have a good conversation going where we're actually listening to what each other's actually saying. So I'm going to speak to some of the moral foundations that are commonly associated with the conservative folks. We're talking about fairness, we're talking about care, and we're talking about liberty here, and the sanctity of the individual. So these are a lot of very important ideas here. And we're also talking about loyalty towards our children, like treating our children in a loyal and fair way instead of betraying them. And from all perspectives, here's what we're actually doing when we're addressing these things and making sure that appropriate education is being covered, that children and adults are able to access their basic needs, and then a little bit, that they can be safe and not have to worry about where the next meal is coming from, whether they're going to be safe, whether they're going to be out in the cold, all these basic concepts. All of these things pile into, if these things are addressed and the baseline is covered, then everybody improves. The baseline experience improves. Everybody gets better. And the research backs this. If these things are covered, if you're thinking about this from a fiscal perspective, if these things are covered and we address these things early on, GDP goes up. If these things are covered, rates of crime drop drastically. If these things go up, overall mental and physical health improve. And if you want to see some research on this, I recommend looking up ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. The research is phenomenal, and it's just getting better on what adverse childhood experiences do in relation to the outcomes. And if we can nip these things in the bud and focus on addressing environmental issues, then the outcomes improve for everybody. They don't just improve for the special needs kid, they improve for their peers who are typically, big air quotes here, typically developing, right? They improve for the neurodiverse and the neurotypical. They improve for everybody. So if we can address these problems, these deficits within our society, it's not an argument about one person getting more than another person. It's not about an argument of fairness versus cheating, because I know a lot of people worry about that. They look at somebody else who's getting maybe a little bit more and they're like, that's not fair. Well, guess what? What I need and what you need aren't the same thing. Calorically speaking, I need to eat certain foods and you need to eat different foods because our bodies need different things. In fact, if we dive down even deeper, the things that my body needs nutrient wise is not going to be identical to you. So what? We're going to feed all of our children, educationally speaking, an identical sludge and expect it to create healthy human beings? And that's where the behavior analytic approach helps a lot, because again, it goes back to it's right for the individual based off of the behaviors are right for the individual based off their environment and learning history. And I'll tell you something to bring that story I told you full circle. So my IQ tested pretty low. That's the reason why the teacher said what she said. Last time I had an IQ test, which was when I was 18, I scored 144. For anybody who understands that,
I thought IQ couldn't change.
That's what they said. IQ couldn't change. But here's the thing. I was in an environment where I could learn. Okay, my parents opted to homeschool. Then they found a charter school that allowed for distant learning. This is prior to the internet becoming a big thing. So, dial-up internet, that sort of thing. So we had a charter school where my parents would go out and find, and we would contract with professionals in the area to teach. And so my chemistry teacher worked at the Sacramento Water Lab. My math teacher that taught me geometry and algebra, he worked on the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. Okay. My economics teacher had an MBA. My history teacher was an amateur historian who had written some and locally published some books. Like, I had people who were passionate about what they had. And so when I was in classes, it wasn't just your typical bell ringing thing. And it was an environment where I thrived. And then on top of that, at the time, California had a law in place. Since then, it's changed so that I believe if you're a resident, education is free, period. But at the time, it was if you're under the age of 18 and you're attending college level courses, the state will pay for your tuition. So I attended the local community college, and I got a lot of my high school equivalent courses, which were remedial courses for other kids. And then I started building on that with college credits. And I was a little big for my age, like height wise. And because I always thrived better with older kids anyways, I was a little goofy here and there, but I generally did a pretty good job blending in. Despite my parents insisting that I wear a button-down shirt everywhere I went, I fixed that. I'd wear a t-shirt underneath and roll it up and hide it in my backpack as soon as they left. Anyways, but like I was in an environment where I could thrive. And instead of being told what I couldn't do, I was instead asked, what do you want to do? And I see the environment that kids are being brought up in, and I'm seeing where they're being told this is a problem, that you're a problem, these things are a problem, what's wrong with you? And it breaks my heart. And then on top of that, if you start adding in race, if you start adding in class, like it's like we're handing crap soup to these kids and expecting them to thrive off of it. And it's not okay. I was incredibly lucky and privileged. I can't believe how amazing things turned out for me. And why does it have to be up to the luck of the draw? When we can modify the environment, when we can change the way we approach things, when we have a science that backs up how we approach things, not just one science, multiple sciences, all the different fields of human behavior.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Nothing to be sorry about. That is, there's so much there. But this is why, like, these are the observations also that I have been making as well, that it's just, there's some disconnect, right? There's, we shouldn't, teachers, I don't believe that I've met any teacher who has any, they don't want to devalue children. They don't want to cause harm, short-term or long-term harm. But they're just essentially, and what I've seen is like repeating the same messages that they've been taught, which is what we do. Like, we're taught something, and we come to believe that to be true, and that's the way that we should do things. And then we do, we repeat those behaviors, we do those things. And they feel as if they're doing right by the child or by the children, by the family. And so it has been really heartbreaking, actually, because the parents also believe that the teachers are doing right by their children. They're doing the best that they can with what they have.
Yeah.
And I would just put out there that, most of these people are being equipped with inadequate toolboxes, right? They don't have the tool skills to adequately serve the needs of children and families. And so, they're using the tools that they have, but they're the wrong tools. And because they're using the wrong tools, they're causing harm. Right. So, to put in I was going to try to use some sort of illustration, but I can't think of a really good one right now. That's not going to come off really awkward. But we're trying to nail in a tiny nail. Trying to nail in a tiny nail and, only so far. And we have a giant sledgehammer. That's the wrong tool for the job that we're doing.
Yeah.
And so, what I'm trying to do now is to help people see the bigger picture, and not in a way where there's any blame to be had, because, as we've spoken about, these are systems that have been developed over time, and they have evolved. Like systems and culture evolves based on contingencies. Like, okay, if this is, working for people and benefiting people in some way, shape, or form, we're going to keep doing that. And we're going to stop doing these other things that aren't coming in contact with reinforcement. And so systems evolve, not necessarily for the greater good. It's just for, unless we're doing things in a very thoughtful, meaningful way, right?
Yeah.
And so the thing that happened in the past year that really shifted my thinking, or not necessarily shifted it, but refined it in some way. So this past year, I taught a full year as a special education teacher, and it was a very good experience. And it was also giving me an opportunity to again, see some of those patterns and through different lenses, like through, over the past couple of years, I've learned a lot about ACT and how to apply behavioral science, social justice issues. And so it's just look through and interpret things that are happening. And I've also through that kind of, dealt with some of my own personal trauma and patterns of behavior that were kind of impacting, how I was seeing things. And it was just really interesting to be able to be the observer without necessarily trying to change anything per se. What I really started to see was, again, like, this isn't a system filled with people who are trying to do wrong by children and families. It's just they're all set up for failure. And it's just this constant, like, weird, like, coercive cycle of contingencies that are,
So what you're saying is that
I don't know.
Their behavior is right for their environment and their learning history? Is that what you're saying?
Oh my gosh, exactly. I am saying that their behavior is right for their environment and their contingencies. Exactly. So it's like, there's nothing wrong with the people who are doing the things, but if they knew better, I bet you they do better.
Well, and
right,
that's what
what happens. When we know better, we do better.
And that's what environmental modification is understanding the day that it clicked. And I was like, wait, I'm a part of the environment. It's not me observing the environment and I'm separate from it. I'm a part of the environment. Okay. A lot of autistics talk about how they feel like they're aliens observing the rest of humanity. I totally get that. Yes, that was me. Like Strange Planet, the comic. Ooh, man, that's my jam. Like the things that Nathan illustrates. I've thought those things, not exactly that way, but it's just like this is so perfect. It's exactly the way I felt. And the thing that dropped the connection and made it so that I was passionate and wanted to be involved and stopped me thinking I was an alien observing the rest, a different species, was when I realized I am a part of the environment. What I do alters the environment. And that's what self-management is all about. And that's one of the reasons I love ACT. For those who don't know what that is, acceptance and commitment therapy or training, which the purview for behavior analysts is the training component, because they're self-management skills. There is a talk therapy / psychotherapy component to it. And that's the purview of cognitive behavioral therapists or dialectical behavioral therapists. We focus on the training side. That's our jam. We make peanut butter and axe sandwiches. So let's make a peanut butter and axe sandwich. You, a teacher, listening to this podcast, maybe, or you, a parent, is listening to this podcast, or you, a behavior analyst, is listening to the podcast. You see these contingencies in play. You see the parents, the teachers, the administrators, all responding to the contingencies. What can we do to alter the contingencies? What are the things that we can use? Abby, what can we put in our toolbox to change this? I have some ideas, but I want to hear what you have to say.
So I think the first step is to simply observe and accept what is. And what I mean by that, so that's kind of the, one of the components of acceptance and commitment training is acceptance, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to be able to see the things for what it is, see the things for what they are, and not become emotionally attached to those things, right?
You've actually described
so
self
we need
as
to
context.
defuse, which is that made up word.
Yep. You've described self as context and diffusion as well as acceptance.
Yeah. And so, the first thing I would like people to begin to understand is that, number one, while things might be challenging right now and things might be hard to look at and feel like we have caused them, we don't have to take ownership for what is necessarily, but we do have the responsibility to make changes in our lives, right? And so what I want to tell people is, or what I'd like to share is, I'd like to share some data. Because data, I know some people will hear that word data and be like, like it's aversive, just the word, hearing it. But it's important because it puts things in context. The fact is that there are 750 million adults in this world who are illiterate. And there are 6 out of 10 people, 6 out of 10 children who are not acquiring basic literacy. And I didn't really understand this, right? My attention has been on individuals with disabilities and kind of this kind of subset of the human experience. And when I said I had some pivotal experiences, one of them was reading Kimberly Behrens's book, Blind Spots, where she really started to open my eyes up to that there's a bigger issue at play here with education and literacy. And so in her book, she started to describe the data and share them. And at first, when I first saw those, I had this emotional reaction, like, there's no way, right? There's no way that this can be true, right? So I had that emotional response. I had those those thoughts of denial, right? But also I began to, sit with that feeling, sit with those thoughts. Thoughts are just thoughts. And now let's get curious, right? Let's start to actually investigate, discover what really is. And so I started to dig in what was going on in my own environment, my own little world here in rural Alaska, and digging around some of the educational data. And what I found was that 61% of children tested were below proficient in reading. And when I looked at that and broke that down even further, and looking at specifically, so, we're in a rural community, Title I schools, relatively, low economic status. There are 4 school districts that serve less than 1,000 kids. And so when you look at 61% of those children are unable to read proficiently, I got curious about what that looked like, kind of broken down on demographics. And so I looked specifically at our Native Alaskan students who are in this area. And do you want to take a guess as to the difference between just looking at the total and broken down by, I looked at the breakdown of Native Alaskan students and economically disadvantaged students, what the differential might be?
I'm gonna take a stab in the dark and say about 80% are
82%.
Okay. And I hate
82% of the
that statistic is consistent across all minorities, with the very few exceptions. Some of those exceptions being the minorities are typically held up as examples of, they're doing great, like East Asian, but those are the exceptions.
100%. And so the data came out to show that 82% of Native Alaskan students were below proficient in reading, and 69% of economically disadvantaged students were below proficient in reading, which was higher than the average. not surprising though, as you said, because that is consistent. And that is what, when I read Dr. Behrens's book, that was what struck me so hard, where I have been, I've been in this, the field of education since 2000. I started my master's in 2006, so and graduated in 2008. So, my view was that this was just individuals with disabilities or, disabled persons, what I was looking at. But what was like revealed to me was that it's bigger than that. And it's bigger than disability status, right? Educational justice, when you really look at it, it is about race. It is about the disability status. It is about class. It is about sex. Like there are some consistent patterns that we see, and we could say that they're not true, but data don't lie, right?
Data don't lie.
And the data are what.
Yes, and I want to bring this home from a behavior analytic perspective here, make it personal, because these statistics, they're very important, but it's kind of overwhelming. So I'm going to bring it into year 3 of me being a special ed teacher. I spent a lot of time reflecting back on the things that I did right and why I did right, and breaking it down into what I did right. So year 3 special ed teacher, being hired as the behavior special ed teacher for Canyon View Middle School, was asked to, because the reading intervention teachers were overwhelmed and their classes were full and they couldn't take any more kids, was asked to take 2 minority students. Actually, I'm sorry, 3 students, 2 of which were minorities who were testing low. It was response to intervention. None of them had an IEP, but that's within my role as a special ed teacher. So a little bit overwhelmed, I say, okay. And instead of doing the curriculum exactly the way that every other of the teachers did, I used the curriculum, but then I went out and I was like, what's a good computer-based program that's going to help these kids learn some fluency, get them reading better. So I went out, I did a little research, I found a program. I asked the administrators to pay for it. They said no. I said, what if I paid for half of it? And they said, okay, fine. So I had to basically cough up half of it for my for my students. But hey, I was like, I want these kids to succeed, and I think this is going to help them. And here's what I did. Instead of doing what other teachers typically did, is I said to the kids, hey, what's something you like to do? And they're like, we like the regular show. And I'm like, cool. Tell you what, if you can get 2 cards a day done and you can do 10 minutes a day minimum at this proficiency level on this fluency reading program, the rest of the class, we can watch the regular show. You know how fast those kids got that stuff done? You know how proficient they became? In 1 quarter, that is 2.5 months of intervention, all 3 of my students jumped from significantly below reading level to just a little bit above reading level in the case of 2. And the 1 student who a lot of people would talk about and say things about like, he's not worth it, that sort of thing, who I later found out had lost a family member to suicide. He jumped by 6 grade levels. He went from being able to barely read at a 3rd grade level to reading at a high school level. Last I heard from him, he was a reader. He loved it. He'd talk about it. And if I had taken the typical approach, the typical of quasi-aversive, you come in, you do the cards, everybody's really strict. But instead I paired with the kids. I did preference assessments. I had some flexibility. I individualized to them. And I'll bet you money, that they won't remember my name, but they will remember that one teacher who let them watch the regular show if they got their work done.
Yeah. That one teacher that treated them like a human being.
Shocker.
Right? So I've got two. These are not my stories, but these are two stories that I've heard recently that to me are just pivotal in my thinking and why I am so stinking passionate about making sure that people understand the scope and the depth of the problem, but not only that, but the empowerment that comes with knowledge, right? Knowledge is power. So my mentor, who has been Michael Maloney, who's been teaching me and mentoring me in direct instruction and precision teaching and ensuring that, so I am becoming a competent practitioner myself, because this wasn't the core of my training, but I am working towards, developing my skills as a direct instruction teacher and precision teacher. One of the stories he shared during my initial training was about a truck driver. And he shared the story of this truck driver who was severely injured and was no longer able to drive truck due to the severity of his injury. And so he had to go to retraining, retraining program to help him get, trained with new skills to take on a new job. And what they quickly found out was that this person was illiterate, that he was unable to read. And so that organization reached out to Michael Maloney and contracted with him to support this individual and others who were in similar situations to provide direct and remedial academic intervention to support so for the retraining program. And so he told this story of this man, truck driver, severely injured, needed remedial academic help, couldn't read. And, he said he was, doing the program. He was showing up, he was participating. He was all he was on board, doing the thing. And he said one day this guy came in and he was, he's big, tall, burly guy. And, had this just look on his face, just looked really angry, right? And Michael's first initial reaction was just that covert verbal behavior, oh my gosh, what's going on? This guy looks like he's gonna punch me at my lights out and what yada yada. And so but they started working and kind of it wasn't getting any better. And so Michael said that he finally asked the man, what's up, man? You look angry and you look like something's wrong. You look like you're about to jump over the table at me. And he said the guy slammed his fist down on the table and he was like, that's it. That's all I needed to do, learn how to read. That's all I needed to do to learn how to read was this. I'm not a stupid person. I'm not incapable of learning. And it was he went through 50 years of life believing that there was something inherently wrong with him. He was incapable of learning. But when given the right supports and somebody who believed in him, believed it was possible and empowered him, he learned how to read and was able to take that and then carry that forward in his life. So that was the first story that I was just okay, this is something that is affecting so many people.
Yeah.
And the second story is a story of a younger person who had spent 9 years in the special education system and began working with a behaviorist on academics and academic remediation. And they went to the trouble to actually analyze and calculate how much money had been spent. And this kind of goes back to those, kind of those moral understandings that we need to connect to.
Those moral foundations.
They went back and calculated how much was spent, on this child's education relative to the progress that had been made. And the school district had spent $500,000 on this child's education by the time they were in 9th grade, and had made little to no progress. Like essentially, like had goals that had been in the IEP for years. Same goals, same thing, no progress. They began working with this professional colleague of mine, and after a year, $15,000 of direct instruction services, direct instruction, precision teaching, no longer qualifies for special education. 1 year, $15,000. And I mean, you think about just like the educational money, right, that is saved there. Think about the long-term aspects of that. You mentioned earlier ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences, educational trauma. And Zig Engelman labeled this. He wrote a book on it, "The War on Educational Abuse." And it does, like, in my opinion, it does also, like, it does raise to that level, because not only are we convincing parents and children that they're incapable of learning, right? Spending millions and billions and trillions of dollars on, quote unquote, big fat air quotes, educating these children with no significant benefit. And then they're going into the adult world. What happens then, Brian? They are joblessness, houselessness, substance abuse, domestic violence. I mean, just, go through the list of all the poor social and behavioral and health outcomes that are linked to ACEs. They're linked to poor, to illiteracy. And just think of how much pain and suffering we could prevent if we simply provided children and families with what they need, the supports that they need that met them exactly where they're at.
Yeah. And ultimately, this all comes down to, like, all these things come down to, we all want a better world. I've only met maybe 1 or 2 people that I'm pretty sure became teachers just because it was a steady, stable thing and not because it was a passion. Maybe 1 or 2 out of thousands of teachers that I've had the privilege of meeting. And even then, I suspect that those 1 or 2 probably started with a little bit of that passion and then gave up pretty quick because of the contingencies. So little hypothesizing there, but pretty consistently I'm seeing teachers as being people who are passionate, who truly are trying to be the heroes that they needed when they were kids, trying to make the world better. And frankly, a lot of administrators, the same thing. I think that they started out that way. And then they fall into the systems and they do the shrug their shoulders, I'm just doing my job. I can't do anything else. And the only reason why I didn't stay in education is because I couldn't stand that attitude. I couldn't. Every single time. So I wanted to move into a place where I could continue to do the thing that I love, which is work with the humans and treat them like humans and be the hero that I needed when I was a kid. Right. So that's the things that's what I wanted to do. What I didn't want to do is have to persistently surf a line where I wanted to tell the parents what they could do and what they could ask for and what the things that they should be able to do and ask for. and let them know that they're the ones that have the power. Them and their student are the ones that have the power. If the student can get engaged and involved, beautiful, perfect. And then the self-advocacy. There's tons of research that shows when the student is self-advocating, especially in middle school and high school, that outcomes alter drastically. But I wanted to just shout to the parents, please don't skip reviewing the procedural safeguards. Let's go over this. Like you have the option to say, I want to go through this and understand it. Please fight for your kid. Like fight for your kid in a kind, compassionate way towards the teacher. And I try to do that whenever I'm advising parents when they're like, well, what should I do? I'm consistently saying, remember that the teacher is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. But if you're compassionate to them, and then you put your foot down firmly and say, no, we're doing this. This is what's available. This is what should be done. I did my research. Then typically what the teacher does is they go, and then they have to get an administrator. And then the teacher goes, and then they have to call somebody at the district. And then the district person's like, no. Or maybe they'll be like, okay. But if they do the no, then you follow the procedural safeguards and say, no, we got it. I'm making a very appropriate request. I'm requesting, here's the terminology you need to use, a free and appropriate education. That's the terms you need to use right there. And I want my child to be in a least restrictive environment. FAPE and RTI. Those are going to be some key terms that you parents out there, behavior analysts, need to know. And it all goes back to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Individuals Disability Act of 1999, the Individuals Disability Act of 2004, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. All those are the 4 core laws that affect educational law. And then there's tons and tons and tons of case law where school districts have tried to play by the game, the system game, and slide underneath. And then it's been challenged by parents who are willing to fight. And then it goes to the courts, and the courts say, no, you're required by law to do this. And this actually has a very wonderful history. The start of this entire process came from Brown versus Board of Education. That big Supreme Court case that made it so that segregation in schools was not acceptable. And that's the foundation for the 14th Amendment. Brown versus and the Brown versus Board of Education is the foundation for why things have, with regards to 504s and IEPs, are there. And if you know what rights are available, because I think we're trying to do some system corrections. I see people trying to improve things, but if you don't know what's in your toolbox, you can't fight. Or no, not fight. Fight's wrong. That's aggressive. That's conflicting. That's the wrong approach. You can't modify the environment.
Yeah.
That's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah.
It's modify the environment.
Yeah. And the phrase that I use is effectively advocate for meaningful change, right?
Yes.
If you don't know the laws, if you don't know your rights, if you don't know the rights of those who you're serving, then you are unable to, you do not have the tools to adequately and effectively advocate for meaningful change, right? If we haven't empowered parents and students with those tools, understanding their rights, they're at a disadvantage. And one of the things that I would just like to put out there for people to be aware of is that the people we serve, right? Whoever that is, whoever it is that you serve, it is important for the it's important for the parents to know what their rights are. And it's also important for the individual to know what their rights are. But what I want to bring to people's awareness is that it's not always only the person you're serving that is affected by disability. And so when you mentioned, when you mentioned procedural safeguards, right? Making sure that parents are understanding their rights, the rights of their children, and those procedural safeguards. I would simply suggest that we need to do our due diligence to make sure that we're helping people really understand their rights, not just handing them a paper packet and saying, go home and read this. Because as we've just really kind of, tried to wrap our minds around, is that there are a lot of illiterate people in this world who may not self-disclose that, right? They may just be simply just, living their lives, how they're living their lives, not realizing, how much that is impacting them. Reading is hard. So no, I'm not going to read this big packet of legalese, right? Yeah. We have to make it accessible. And that's where we get into the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. There's a requirement of ADA that businesses, government institutions, and businesses ensure effective communication with all people. That includes parents, consumers, students, and everyone. And we have the responsibility to make sure that they truly understand, not that they just have a paper packet that they've been handed. We have to ensure that they understand their rights. And I believe that it's our moral responsibility to make sure that that's happening.
And if you're looking for resources on this, if you type in procedural safeguards, your state, and breakdown or abbreviation or things like that, almost every state that I've done this for has a summary paper that basically breaks down what the procedural safeguards are. And the procedural safeguards are a requirement by federal law. Basically, in order for states to be receiving funding from the federal government, they have to be following the expectations of the procedural safeguards. They have to have systems in place. Every state implements it slightly differently, but the core components are always the same. And in case because income is a component here, because class is an issue, right? And disability is also an issue. If parents and families don't have a lot of money, guess what? A part of the procedural safeguards is that if you're following the procedures, the district is required to provide legal counsel for you from a third party, not from their lawyers. So you're not just out in the blue and like, well, if I have to fight for this, I can't afford it. Well, actually you can, because the system's built in to allow for that. But again, the information is not freely shared, and that the system that has the oppression going on banks on that. So if you're a teacher who wants to make a difference, but you don't want to, because you're worried about being punished by your school district because you're pushing boundaries. I have been told this so many times as a teacher. You're just always pushing, Brian. Well, if you want to avoid that, but you also want to help your parents, then at every IEP meeting, you insist that you go over the parents' rights and you make sure that they understand them. Because that's your legal obligation. And if a school district tries to punish you for that, document. Period. Because any violation of that, including repercussions for you doing your job, means that that's a slam dunk lawsuit against the school district, and the school districts don't want to lose all lawsuits. So I hate to say it, but we got to use some aversiveness for the school district of loss of money to make sure that they're following the law.
Yeah. And Brian, I'm so happy that you said that and you brought up that point, because fear is a major motivator, right? Fear of punishment is a major motivator for people to avoid behavior, avoid doing things. And this is where I really do believe that ACT and developing psychological flexibility as individuals is critical in ensuring that we're able to effectively advocate for meaningful change, because we have to be willing. We have to be willing to do the hard things, even when it's hard, even when our hearts race, even when our throats start to close up and tears come to our eyes. Yes, it hurts, but guess what? Where there is pain, that's because you care. And that's because that's where your values are. And it is your moral and ethical and legal responsibility. But I think of it, the moral and ethical to me is where it's like, that's where the heart work comes in. Like, we have to do this. It's what's right. And, if there's pushback, if there's complaints, if you don't like it, I'm sorry. But I too, as a human being, adult, I have rights.
So I'm going to, if you're all right with this, share a quick story in relation to this topic.
Yeah.
That's going to help you with, or help our audience to see that this works. So I pretty regularly have people reaching out to me. And after people hear this, I'm sure I'm going to get more people reaching out to me. I try to make sure I have the spoons for it. Asking for my advice, asking for where they can go. And I typically direct them either to other specialists or mentors or things like that. But if I have the knowledge that I direct them towards where they can find the information, then I provide the support as needed. And in this case, a behavior analyst reached out to me saying, hey, this is going on. This student is not receiving their supports. This is what the contingencies are. This is what's happening in the school. This is what the school is doing and saying, these sorts of things, trying to make sure, not giving me any identifying information, that sort of stuff. And I basically said the stuff that I said here, which is, what are the procedural safeguards? I looked up the procedural safeguards for that state. I pointed them towards their rights. I pointed them towards advocacy groups in the area. I told them what they needed to do and what they could do. And I kept coming back to it. I said, tell the parent that they have the power. The school and the administrators are going to make it out like they have to sign the document. Do not walk out of that IEP meeting with a signed document unless they follow through with what you say, right? Be willing to give and take a little bit here and there, because we have to be compassionate and understanding people. But at the end of the day, if the supports that the student needs are not provided, do not walk out of that room with a signed document. Refuse to. And the parent almost caved. And then this behavior analyst who was invited there by the parent, by the way, parents, if the school district says nobody from the outside can't come in, that's hokum. That's bullshit. You can invite anybody you want into the IEP meeting. It is your right. So, step one, don't fall for that. Okay, so they walked out of the IEP meeting because the behavior analyst helped to bolster her client and the parent of her client. They went back to the family's home. Administrator and teacher pull up and start pounding on the door and saying that they have to sign the document. And they said, you're not invited to be here, leave or we're calling the cops. The next day, the school district called. The human rights person said, we're going to give you the things that you're asking for. Because there were basic things that the student needed. Basic. Then, so they tried to pull a quick one, fast one on the parent. So the parent said, well, I want to see what this looks like. So they went to the special school that the kid was going to be going to. and it was the wrong placement. It was not least restrictive environment. The student was going to be placed with children who were significantly younger than this student, significantly. And it was in a basement. It was bad lighting. It was just, you don't want humans to be in those settings. And the parent was like, what's going on? And by the way, a little background here. This parent wasn't a minority and did have some literacy issues. So the BCBA was there supporting, guiding along the way. The reason I know this level of detail is because they left, refusing to sign the IEP again. BCBA contacted me again and said, we really need your help. And so I said, here's the deal. I can't do more unless I have a contractual agreement with you. So I pull up a little contract I have, and the requirement for my contract is $1 US. That's it. Because there needs to be some sort of exchange. So we did the exchange, all taken care of. I was able to then find out more information. I was following all the appropriate paperwork was signed, so that way information was able to be disclosed. I was able to go into a little bit more details and find out other information I'm not able to tell you here. But long and short of it, I said, don't cave. Because what they're doing is not following least restrictive environment. It's not following free and appropriate public education. It's completely violating the Americans with Disabilities Act, because the area where, and IDEA, because the area where you're describing does not comply with requirements for that. So just refuse. School district tried pushing it. They had the lawyer come in. The family said, we're following the procedural safeguards. We want to have our counsel. Next day, they get a call and they say, we will pay for your child to be receive an education at a private school in the area that is specialized for your child's needs. Because they knew they would lose. Right now,
Right.
the behavioral needs and the educational needs of this child, as of the last time I checked in, contract's about to expire, so I don't need to check in after that. But last I checked in, child's blooming. Child's getting what is needed to grow.
Yeah.
And it actually is costing the school district less.
And that's what.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, at the end of the day, which is so interesting, because, I mean, there's that, I think, that inherent drive to fight things like this, when in reality, if you do the math, if you look at all things considered, right? Number one, this individual is getting exactly what they need in the way that they need it, right? And then we're also preventing further legal action, and we're preventing future harm. So yeah, that's a good, that is a good case example of why this is so important to do and keep pushing. And you mentioned, I mean, coaching parents not to cave. I had a colleague who a few years back reached out to me and said that she was starting to, basically her only role was to be the parent's right-hand person at IEP meetings. And so she was training in simple mindfulness program, mindfulness curriculum. So she could meet the parents before the meeting, sit out in the car with them, and do some mindfulness, present moment exercises with the parents, so they could go into that meeting just crystal clear, as focused and calm as they could be in the present moment, so they could more, most effectively advocate for their child's rights. So don't give up, parents. We love you and we'll support you and we'll help you navigate this process, because it can be very daunting, and it can be very punishing, and it can be very easy just to throw your hands up and say, fine, I'll go homeschool my kid. because you can't seem to get your act together. But again, that's, can't force homeschool. Forced homeschool is not a thing. And it's not appropriate. Parents who choose to homeschool and homeschool for the right reasons, 100%, but
and I can tell you right
can't
now
force
that,
it because that's the only option.
There's wonderful things that come from homeschool. I was homeschooled, and I'm really grateful that I was. There was a lot of really good things that came from it. But don't do it because you're feeling like the school district is forcing you into it. Because if you do feel that, well, as the case that I provided as an example is, the school district is actually obligated to provide the education. So if they can't and won't, then they have to pay for it. And most school districts receive their funding from taxes, and that money is allocated for your child to the school district, whether your child's receiving the education or not, unless you're in an area that has voucher system. And so if that's the case, then the school district is profiting off of you schooling, doing their job for them. And that's kind of 100%. Screwed up. It's also one of the reasons why I'm a big advocate for a voucher system, because I like the fact that parents can actually have some choice and power, and it puts more power back in the hands of kids. And I know teachers unions hate that, and I belong to the teacher union as well. And one of the teachers unions that I belong to was like, we hate voucher systems. And I was like, nope, I think they're great. I'm not going to toe the party line on this one.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, the reality is, so like the state that I'm in Alaska now, but the state I was in before was Arizona. And in Arizona, they have, I think they have a really nice, well-developed, I think, voucher system. I haven't been there for a few years, so who knows exactly how it's running, but, it allows for that flexibility, and it allows for parents to have choices. And if they're not doing, exactly what needs to be done, then the parents have they can utilize those resources that are dedicated to, that are kind of earmarked for their, to their children for the enrollment count. So they can use it in the way that makes best sense for them and for their children. So,
yeah. Okay, so we've talked about some tools in the toolkit, including covering procedural safeguards, covering parent rights. I just want to reiterate here, the worst thing that you can do in this entire situation is start assigning otherness to the teachers and the administrators, even though I've been a little bit passionate, and I've been doing that myself. So bad me, slap myself on the wrist here. Like, seeing people within their context, giving them that benefit of the doubt is really important, especially when you're in the midst of this, because when you start getting combative, then communications break down. And so resist the temptation to call names, please. It's not going to help anybody. And just focus back in and go back to the facts, because you can't argue with the facts. The facts are that there are 4 core laws, and there are other laws on the books too, especially in different states, but there are 4 core laws in place that protect the rights of the individual, that the parent and the individual, the student, the child, the individual in question, have a right to receive these basic services per the laws of the land, per the ethics that we have, per all these other things. So if you focus back on that and say, this is what you're required to do by the law, even if you don't fully understand it, or even if you're slightly off on it, by bringing it back to that and just being very cool, collected, and saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to do, you're going to feel like a broken record, depending on the school district and the responsiveness of the people in question. But if you keep doing that, eventually you're going to get the kid the things that they need. And I'm going to warn you that there's going to be a comparison that frequently is used in education of, we're not obligated to give your child a Ferrari, we can give them a Ford Focus, right? That little comparison of vehicles, like the Ford Focus gets you there.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is, that's kind of a crappy comparison. Like, because an education is not a car.
Yeah.
Right? This is something that's going to make the difference between the success or failure of this individual in the world that they live in. And so focusing in on, okay, this services that are needed, they're not just for academics, they're also for social and emotional needs. Mm-hmm. This is a part of the law. No, you can't say that, oh, we tried. Yes, you have to provide documentation. Yes, you have to show me what you're doing. And just holding that accountability. And then using your resources, engaging other people who might need to help you. So in the case of the behavior analyst that I told you about and that parent, that behavior analyst found resources, reached out. I didn't have to do a whole lot other than just informing them of the law and telling them what they can and can't do. And then they just held the line. And then when they got extra pushback, I was like, all right, well, you need my consultation services so that I can see this information. This is the contract. All right, we got all the paperwork signed. Let me look it over. Oh, yep, definitely. Hold the line. You got this. And there are tons of nonprofits out there that are all focused on this. There are tons of agencies and supports that you can do. And one thing that you mentioned we talked about when we're off screen is that if the parent has a disability or special needs of any sort, that with the Americans with Disabilities Act, if the school district or teacher or whoever is preying upon that or relying on that ignorance, that's actually a violation of another federal law, the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. So violation of Rehabilitation Act, 1973, IDEA 99 and 2004, and ADA, that's a lot. You have the law on your side.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. So yeah, absolutely. So what, we are, our Alaskan Oasis, that is kind of the direction that we're going. We are working with local families. It's kind of a community-driven grassroots effort. We're partnering with Tony Biglin of Values to Action and Michael Maloney of Teach Your Children Well. And we're really trying to help families understand that there's more opportunities, there's things that they can ask for, that there's things that they can get. And it's just a matter of knowing, just awareness, right? And so we're actively supporting families on their journeys who, these are families that have kind of been forced into homeschool education. And so we're trying to help them, get access to resources now to help, prevent, more challenges from happening. And we're also supporting them on their journeys. They're actively seeking out support from advocates and working to better understand their rights and their roles and their responsibilities. And it is just such a very, it's a wonderful position to be in, because, not only can we serve the children and the families in the way that they need, providing them with that those remedial education services. Again, not just the learners, not just the children, those that are in the public or in the school system, but the adults too, right? We've got some big challenges ahead of us. But to me, it's all about empowerment, right? knowledge is power. When we give them the skills and the time and the space to understand that they have the capability, right? Mm-hmm. They are capable of affecting change in their lives and their children's lives, empowering them with skills and knowledge and tools. It's has the potential to create big positive changes in the world. And I'm super excited for the future, and I'm excited to kind of share this message with others as well.
Well, I would like, before we wrap up with anything else, I'd like to share one last story, and this story is actually a very important one because it's a story of hope. So there are several stories, and I don't remember the specific school district, so I'm very sorry about this, but there's several stories that have been shared with me by others. And in one case, I worked with a client where this was the story that I found out post facto after I started working with the client, where the school districts didn't do the pattern of behavior that we were talking about, where instead the school districts were proactive and were following through with not only the legal requirements, but the moral and ethical expectations too. And because they went above and beyond, and they didn't try to do we're defending our resources, but instead focusing on the child. And each one of the stories that I'm thinking of, the cases, outcomes totally changed. Things turned around. In some cases, individuals moved into the school districts. In other cases, early intervention, where parents find out and they feel like they're lost and they don't know what to do because this thing that has been thrown at them, they don't understand it. And instead, the district is like, hey, we're here. We heard that you need help. Right? Because, parent confesses to kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher that they're scared about this thing, right? And the district did what they were supposed to do instead of the protective factor. And instead of that adversarial relationship, it was a relationship of we're working together, and it brought the community together. It creates a whole new dynamic. It changes the outcomes. So if you're a teacher listening to this and you're scared and you're worried, you can advocate for a change to these things. If you're an administrator and you're worried that this is going to be because somebody above you is going to give you a hard time about it, you know what? You set the culture where you're at. You create the climate. You can be an instrument for change. Each of us can. We can take action now. And how we take action is making sure people know their rights. And yes, you might be tired. You might not feel like you have the spoons, the energy to be able to do this. But when you live your values, things get better. The times when I wasn't living my values, when I was moving away from the things that I valued, were the times when things were the hardest for me. And even though sometimes the challenges that I've had to face living my values wouldn't have existed had I not, had it been easier to not live the things that I value and care about, the amount of disrespect and I'm not quite sure how to put it, I guess self-loathing that I've had when I was not living up to my values, it's just not worth it. I would rather do what is right than worry about fleeting emotions like happiness, which, by the way, when you do what's right, turns out you are happier. So there you go. So those are my thoughts on the matter. Please afford that compassion for other people. Please see them within their context.
Yeah, that's a perfect note to end on, Brian, and a perfect reminder. Compassion for ourselves and compassion for others is truly that is the core of what, kind of what we need to word, because we're all humans. We're all dealing with a whole lot of things that nobody else knows besides you and your family and your close friends, right? We're all ourselves in context. Mm-hmm. And to have compassion and to have empathy for others, as first and foremost, is critical. It's crucial to the work that we're doing, because we need each other. We need our communities. We can't, I live in a very tiny community, and if we are coming at this combatively and like pointing fingers and we're only furthering divisions. And so that reminder of compassion is key to everything that we do, first and foremost.
Exactly. Oh, okay. Did we cover all the tools in the toolkit? Is there anything else that we may have forgotten?
I think we covered all the tools in the toolkit of educational justice. Yes, absolutely. Okay. I hope so. Well, I'm sure I'm happy to come back. We can continue this conversation depending on the feedback we receive.
Well, and I feel like this would be probably something that we should explore into turning into a CEU. Because I feel like a lot of BCBAs and teachers and other professionals would want to hear more about this. So let's talk about that and perhaps explore that possibility. And if that's the case and it actually happens, then I will update the show notes to reflect that. But no promises, people.
Excellent. Okay. Well, awesome. I will. So I've actually been invited to speak to New Hampshire ABA in a couple weeks, and the goal is to make that an ethics CEU. So I'll put that together, and we'll see if we can make things work. If not for this show, we can do a follow up, and because I'm really, I was an ethics professor one time, in my history, and so that is near and dear to my heart, as any listener who knows me will know very well. So,
well, I think that's a good stopping point. So I'll just, if anybody wanted to reach out to you, Abby, how could they get a hold of you?
So I am available via email. My email address is contact@AFAPW, and that's Action for a Peaceful World, just the first letters of each word.com, AFAPW.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming back on, or coming onto the show, Abby. I said back on because I actually joined Abby on the Tipsy Unicorn podcast. So it feels like I'm doing another show, but it's the first one on this podcast with you. So anyways, folks, remember that the O Behave podcast and the Act Natural podcast, which is my other one, why not? Had a little slip there. They're open source education materials, which means that all or part of them can be used towards continuing education, spreading information, especially relating to behavioral support and mental health services. Please keep in mind that none of the information we provide, it constitutes legal advice, that if you need legal advice, to seek the appropriate licensed person, that this is speaking in generals and not specifics. So if you need those supports, please look for organizations that can support you, and know that there is lots of supports out there. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today, and behave.
Take me down to the river where the peace won't run dry. Gather round at the river where my soul comes to life and I come alive. satisfied. Lord, I know you will deliver like you do every time. And